throughout the presentation, I'll be using some names of firms like Safeway. I guess if you've been to the US, you probably know how big the grocery chain is, like Safeway. But as pure hypothetical examples, it does not imply that whatever I show you is identified as Safeway or some other firms. So recently there's been a debate on how firms set their prices. So it's been the standard to assume that firms set prices to maximize profits according to economic conditions such as, elasticities, marginal cost, etc. For national firms, it implies that if there's a local shock, only local price would adjust, but there will be no reason to adjust prices in some other markets. But recently, there's a growing literature suggesting that firms might be setting uniform prices for all markets. And this suggestion is based on the empirical finding that prices look fairly uniform within a firm, in a sense that the prices do not vary across geographic markets with different economic conditions, especially with demand shocks such as income. So for example, given a grocery chain like Safeway, grocery prices in high income areas seem pretty highly correlated with the price in low income areas. Drywall prices at Home Depot do not vary across many geographic markets. Starbucks and movie ticket prices are the same in New York City and Bloomington, Indiana, where I am. So these empirical findings led to the suggestion that a firm might be setting a single price for all markets. So our paper asks a similar question: how firms set their prices? Do they set them in the standard flexible manner or uniformly like the recent literature suggests? And so we test implications of these two pricing models empirically. We look at national retail firms' price responses to local cost shocks. So we first consider local excise tax changes as the cost shocks because these taxes are levied at the wholesale stage. So from the retailer's perspective, these tax changes are shocks to their marginal cost. We have 73 local excise tax changes for beer, liquor, cigarettes, and soda. And here local means either state or county level. And we also test these implications with different kinds of cost shocks, such as wholesale and transportation costs as well. What we found is that we have very clear evidence against a strong form of uniform pricing model because we see clear price response to the tax change. In other words, the cost shocks are fully passed through to prices in the affected area, but we see absolutely no changes in any other markets, regardless of county or state tax changes, regardless of types of cost shocks, and regardless of products. And I need to be very careful here when I say full pass through though. What I mean is that the pass through to local shock is similar to pass through to national shock, like not attenuated. That's what I mean by full pass through. And you might think that our finding is contradictory to what the recent uniform literature, pricing literature has suggested, but it's actually not. To reconcile our result that prices do respond to local cost shocks and the uniform pricing literature, we need to understand where this uniform pricing theory came from. So the literature has found that price variation is tiny within firm across geographic markets, like beer price at Safeway in the middle of Seattle, which has high income, is highly correlated with beer price at Safeway, like in the middle of nowhere. Although these two places clearly have a huge difference in average income. From this evidence, the literature interpreted as prices do not respond to local shocks within a firm, which led to the theory that maybe a firm is setting a single price overall or across some broad pricing zones. Now, going back to our results, what we found is that prices do respond to local cost shocks within firm, and what the recent literature found is that prices do not vary with demand shocks. So combining these two empirical findings, it seems that firms asymmetrically respond to local demand and cost shocks. They may, not respond to local cost shocks, but they do clearly respond to cost shocks. Why do we care to learn about this? We hope to provide deeper understanding of firms' pricing strategies. Uniform pricing is a huge challenge to standard IO literature when it comes to modeling how firms respond to a shock. But we show that although uniform pricing puzzles may exist with demand shocks, they do not extend to cost shocks. So we draw the line on how far the uniform pricing puzzles can go. So with this paper, we clarify what firms respond to and not to. From the policy perspective, our findings suggest that the statutory incidence may matter to economic burden of taxes. What it means is that whether to tax consumers or producers matters to prices. In like Econ 101, we learned that it doesn't matter whether to tax suppliers or consumers. But since it turned out that firms are unresponsive to local demand shocks, if taxes are, say, imposed on consumers, the incidence is entirely borne by consumers. And this is particularly important for sin taxes because they're often imposed to control consumption, such as alcohol, tobacco, and more recently in the US, sugar-sweetened beverages like soda. And obviously it matters to tariffs because it determines which country bears the cost. Given the asymmetry in price responses from the empirical observations, lastly, we evaluate some widely used pricing models, whether they are consistent with this asymmetry. We'll discuss this if we have time. Okay, now I'll move on to some details. So what are these two pricing models in question and what do they imply? And I'm going to start with the standard model. We usually assume firms set prices flexibly market by market. So if there's a local shock, only local price adjusts, but not in other markets. And it's really easy to show this with an example. So this is a map of the West Coast in the United States. And you see these squares referring to store locations of one national retail firm, like say Safeway. This retailer, like Safeway, operates in many markets in Washington and in Oregon and some other states. Now, suppose that there was a shock in Washington, say marginal cost increase in Washington, but only in Washington. So the blue squares, like Safeway stores in Washington, are directly exposed to the positive cost shock. And the red squares, like Safeway in Oregon, are unexposed stores, but they still belong to the exposed firm. And the standard flexible pricing model implies that Washington prices would change, but there's no reason for prices outside of Washington to change because the shock is specific to Washington. And another implication of the standard model is that firms will respond the same amount to local and national shocks. So for example, if say Washington price respond by 1 due to Washington shock, we will still see the same amount of response to a national shock as long as the sizes of the shocks are the same. This means that the local shocks are fully passed through, where full means the response is the same as to national shock. Okay, now on the other hand, under a strong form of uniform pricing model, a firm charges a single price for all markets. So the price in Washington and Oregon are the same. And this model has 3 testable implications. First one, because the firm sets one price for all when the same shock hits Washington, the price response would be less than it would have been under the standard flexible model. And the amount of this attenuation depends on how much the firm is exposed to the shock. So if the revenue from Washington is tiny, then the price may not even change. But if the majority of the revenue comes from Washington, then the price response could be as high as in the standard model. And the natural second implication is that prices also change in unexposed markets, like Safeway in Oregon. So shocks will spill over to unexposed markets under uniform pricing model. And the last implication is that the local pass-through to local shocks will be lower than the local pass-through to national shocks. So we won't see full pass-through to local shocks under uniform pricing, whereas the standard flexible model predicts the same or similar responses. So summarizing these, we have 3 empirical tests. So number 1, do we see spillovers? And number 2, does the pass-through depend on the exposure to the shock? And number 3, is the price response to local shock the same as to national shock, or is it attenuated? And we test these in the following context. We first look at national retail chains' reaction to local excise tax changes, and we estimate the pass-throughs for exposed and unexposed stores separately. However, we know that excise taxes can be considered as a very specific cost shock. So you might wonder how general our results are. So we also test the local pass-throughs to wholesale cost and transportation cost shocks. Let me start with the empirical evidence from excise taxes as cost shocks. And please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions, or pause for a second. Okay. We look at 13-year time period. Again, these excise tax changes are shocks to retailers' marginal costs. These are not sales taxes. Okay, this is levied in the wholesale stage. For local cost shocks, we found 71 state excise tax changes for beer, liquor, cigarettes over the time period. And we have 2 county level excise tax changes for soda. And there was 1 federal tax change for cigarettes in 2009, from which we estimate pass through to national shock. To measure prices, we use Nielsen retail panel data. It contains over 130 chains and 35,000 stores. We selected 84 widely available products so that we can observe prices in multiple geographic markets. And here, widely available means that the average chance of the product being sold at any store at any given week is higher than 80%. Okay. Here, the product is a unique barcode, like UPC or SKU, the unique barcode that each product has. So we avoid any possible compositional bias from aggregating something up to a category level. So in our setup, the price is defined by product store week, so like UPC store week per tax unit. So for example, beer price in this paper is per 288 ounces of beer, which is about 24 pack, like 1 case. For soda, it's measured in terms of cents per ounce. Before we move on, I would like to show you that we do find the same results that the uniform pricing literature has found. So again, their finding was that within chain, store level income is not correlated with store level prices. So given our selected products and chains, we generate the same graph that you can see in Delavigne-Jenskow QJE paper. The y-axis is the residualized log price net of product year fixed effects relative to chain means, that's centered around 0. And the x-axis is the store income relative to chain mean. And you see 0 correlation between the store level income and store level price. So basically, we see that prices do not respond to some local demand shocks like income within chain. And now I'm going to show our identification of pass-throughs using a case study in Washington, but the same idea applies to all excise tax changes. So Washington increased beer taxes in 2010. It was the largest we observed, about 5% of price. And there were no other beer tax changes in any other states for about a year before and after the change. So it provides a fairly long, clean time window without, tax changes in anywhere else. We estimate the pass-through with difference in differences approach. Naturally, the treatment group is the exposed stores in Washington, and the control group would be the unexposed stores elsewhere. However, there is a potential identification problem in this D&D approach because unexposed stores in exposed chains might have been potentially treated, especially if firms indeed set uniform prices. And here's what I mean. Okay, recall that the blue squares like Safeway in Washington are the stores directly exposed to the cost shock. And the red squares like Safeway in Oregon and here are not directly exposed, but they still belong to the exposed chain. So they might be potentially contaminated control. The good news is that we have actually two other clean control groups. The first is completely unexposed multi-state chains like these green triangles. They exist in multiple states on the East Coast, but not in Washington. So imagine this is like Harris Teeter. Another clean control is the single state chain outside of Washington, like these black circles. Think of this like Ralph's in California. So we use these completely unexposed chains as our control groups, and we estimate pass-throughs of these directly exposed and indirectly exposed stores separately. Now, I would like to show you the time series of price before we move on to the regression. So here, x-axis is the month relative to the change, and the y-axis is the residual price net of store product fixed effects and week product fixed effects. So meaning that this price is adjusted for product specific store and time difference, and it is centered around 0. The green line is the average price of completely unexposed multi-state chain, like Harris Teeter, the green triangles. No responses as expected. Next is the price of single state chain outside of Washington, like Ralph's in California, like the black circles. Okay, no responses. But we see a huge and sudden jump in prices for directly exposed stores in Washington, and our estimated pass-through is about 1.3 on average. Lastly, we see there's no response from indirectly exposed stores, like Safeway stores in Oregon, and the pass-through is estimated at nearly 0. So let me check on the chat. So somebody asked a question, could there be effects on the cost side if sales in Washington drop? Cost of dist per unit, distribution per unit may increase, which may affect neighbor. Yes, so we actually checked the robustness against the border county. So I'll show the results maybe in 5 minutes. Okay. So yeah, so this graph basically highlights that the directly exposed stores respond. However, indirectly exposed stores, although belonging to the exposed chain, did not respond. And the same pattern shows up for all excise tax changes. So we drew the same graph for all changes, except soda, which is coming next slide, but grouped with similar amount of changes. So for tax changes greater than, say, 75 cents, we see an average price increase of about 93 cents among exposed stores. And just like the case study, we see the indirectly exposed stores, like Safeway in Oregon, did not respond at all. And as we look at smaller tax changes, we see smaller responses, but still clear responses. And even the negative tax changes, we see negative pass-throughs, although it's very noisy because we only have 2 cases. But again, no spillovers to unexposed stores. And then we separately drew the same graph for soda. The very same pattern shows up for soda products where the excise taxes are set on the county level rather than state level. And we have two cases, so one Philadelphia and the other in San Francisco. And as you see, the clear responses from the directly exposed stores, but indirectly exposed stores did not respond at all. Okay, so given this identification idea, we set up a simple regression model. For each text change event, we regress the average price at the chain market week level on the following. And let me walk you through each term. The dependent variable is the average residualized price net of store product fixed effects. It means the price relative to store product mean, and then average across stores or products up to chain market week level. This M stands for market, which can be either state or county. The delta tau is the amount of tax change for an event. So for Washington's case, it's $1.13. Post is the dummy, indicating the post period, post tax change period. And EXP is the dummy for directly exposed stores, like Safeway in Washington. And therefore, the coefficient in front of it is the pass-through rate for exposed stores. And we let this pass-through vary by chain. As you can see, there's a C subscript underneath. And next, this IND EXP is a dummy for indirectly exposed stores, like Safeway in Oregon. And therefore, the coefficient in front of it, the rho naught, is the pass-through for indirectly exposed stores, again, chain specific. And this regression is done with control groups of completely unexposed chains. And we also have market fixed effects and week fixed effects. And remember, this equation is specific to each tax change event. So we actually have event market fixed effects and event week fixed effects. All right, so for each tax change event and chain, we get two pass-throughs. So one for exposed stores and the other for indirectly exposed stores with market fixed effects and week fixed effects for each tax change, which generates about 800 pass-throughs. We limit the time window to be 1 year before and after the tax change. And in case there are other states which had other tax changes, we exclude all stores in those states. And because of sampling error, we shrink the coefficients towards the category means, but it really doesn't make much difference. So here's the distribution at pass-throughs for exposed stores, except soda, which is coming in 2 slides. You can see that the majority of the pass-throughs are centered around 1, and the interquartile range is from 0.9 and 1.1. There is a bit of a heterogeneity, but the point is that most of them are away from 0. So this histogram shows that exposed stores clearly responded to the local cost shocks 1-to-1 almost. On the other hand, if you look at the distribution of pass-throughs of indirectly exposed stores like Safeway in Oregon, the pass-through is mostly 0. And these two distributions don't overlap with each other because we reject that the pass-throughs are the same literally 100% of the time if you compare chain by chain. And so the fact that the exposed and indirectly exposed stores react very differently tells us that there's no spillovers. There is some heterogeneity, but again, the point of this entire histogram is that there's no spillovers to unexposed markets. Okay, there was a question. Could prices of beer cigarette products differ in terms of uniform pricing? Is it possible to check if prices are uniform indirectly? So to answer, so I think this question is really important. It is true that empirically, even if we look at 40 different grocery products, we don't see the literal uniform pricing across geographic markets. So the word uniform pricing is kind of confusing in a sense that it makes you think that price is literally flat across geographic markets. However, it's not the case. It is the case that the demand shocks, such as income, being not correlated with prices. So if you actually see if you like say graph the level of prices in different geographic markets, they have different levels. Okay. Okay. So this result that shocks don't spill over is super robust to many specifications. So instead of removing stores in stores exposed to other events, we've removed entire chains exposed to some other events. Still the same result. And instead of chains, we tried removing entire parent firms. So parent firms are like Kroger, which owns many chains such as Harris Teeter, QCF, and Rawls, etc. Even removing the entire parent firms exposed to some other events, still the same results. And as the first question, one might worry about the border crossing activity. So we removed border counties, both inside and outside of the event state. Still same result. We also tried limiting the time window to look at the longer time period. Still the same result. We also tried it by removing single state chain from the control group in case single state chains maybe behave differently than multi-state national chains. Same results. And lastly, the products that we look at for the state excise tax changes can be specific, is in a sense that beer, liquor, cigarettes are very well known for low elasticity products, and they're highly regulated. So maybe this no spillover thing only exists for low elasticity products only, and maybe the excise tax changes are so frequent for these three products. Maybe retailers just pay attention to these specific cost shocks more while neglecting some other cost shocks. And lastly, the shocks that we looked at so far are statewide, meaning if the pricing zone somehow coincide with the state boundaries, then we may not even be able to argue that there's no spillover. However, soda cases show that our results are robust to all of these concerns. Sorry, I think I saw somebody raising hand, but I think it went away. Please do that again if I missed you. So this is basically go ahead.
Still a hand up. I think
Okay.
Nikita?
Yeah, that was me.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I have a question. So what's the role of competition here? So your story is sort of, from the theory perspective, we would say that this is, something like a Bertrand competition is happening there, where the shocks to costs are reflected in price and the shocks to demand are not. And I was wondering if you looked at if you looked at local competition, you have two stores that are essentially next to each other, and one is subject to a cost shock and the other is not, and whether how this kind of shock propagates into prices. Because what you mentioned so far is the taxes, and they are, I think, uniformly applied to everybody in the local area. So.
Correct. That is definitely a fair concern, and I have two answers. So first, it is possible that what we observe is a result of perfect competition, and it is consistent with this, asymmetric responses. If the perfect competition is what's happening. The second answer is that we did actually try controlling for the competition effect. So, there are stores which are exposed to the state, but very close to the boundary, and they may face, more competitions, compared to the stores which is like in the middle of the state, where it doesn't really face competitions from the out of the jurisdiction. So we tried them, and we actually did not find any difference, which was actually weird for us as well. But we just empirically, we did not find any difference between the stores close to the border or just in the middle, like interior of the border of the state. Okay. All right. So you'll just have to trust me that for soda products, we see basically the same pattern, that the shocks do not spill over. One thing that I really want to highlight is that it's super interesting that the indirectly exposed stores in the same state, say like stores in Pittsburgh are still in Pennsylvania, which is an exposed state. They did not respond at all, although the stores in Philadelphia, which is the county that is actually exposed, given a change. So we thought this was really cool that even at the county level, our results are robust. Okay, so the first implication of uniform pricing model is rejected because we see zero spillovers to unexposed markets. And next is to test whether the pass-through is correlated with chain's exposure to the shock. So we actually reject this too. So this is going to be the scatter plot of average pass-through among exposed stores against chain's revenue share from the exposed state measured before the change. And you see that although pass-throughs are heterogeneous across chains, they are not proportional to the exposure. The slope is not significant, and you see this because of this one outlier. And we tried this with different measures of exposure, like dollar values, product level, aggregate level, also tried with different kinds of regressions. But pass-through is like about 100% even when the exposure is nearly zero. So the second implication of uniform pricing model is also rejected. And the last is to test whether the pass-through to local shock is attenuated compared to the national shock. So let's estimate the pass-through to national shocks. It's rare, but there's one national excise tax change in April 2009. Federal excise tax on cigarettes increased by about 60 cents. The identification with national change is tricky because there's no, cross-sectional variation. So we consider the control group as some other non-cigarette grocery products within chain state. So this is the time series of average residualized price net of store week fixed effects. The blue is the cigarette prices, and as you can see, the price increased about 90 cents when the law was enacted. The black line is the average of about 1,500 products in 40 different grocery categories. And we also tried it with synthetic controls, which is the red line, and we pretty much found the same thing. Okay. So I'm gonna skip the details about the regressions, but basically what we need to keep in mind is that the control group is cigarette versus some other grocery stores. And we do control for the producer price index, which approximates the wholesalers and manufacturers input cost. And we actually allow this PPI effect to vary flexibly by chains. And we have a bunch of fixed effects. So category chain state fixed effects and chain week fixed effects. So basically everything here, like fixed effects, coefficients, are all chain specifics. So let's now compare the pass-through to national shock and local shock. You can see that the pass-through to this federal tax change is very similar to the state tax changes. The mean and median are both centered around 1. What does that mean? That means we reject the third implication of uniform pricing model because there's no attenuation or anything lower that we observe in pass-throughs to local shocks compared to the national shocks. Okay, so let me summarize our results so far. We found clear evidence against a strong form of uniform pricing model. Because we see clear pass-through for exposed stores, but pass-through does not spill over to unexposed markets. The pass-through does not vary with exposure. And lastly, pass-through to local and national shocks are similar. Therefore, the uniform pricing puzzles do not exist with cost shocks, although they might exist with demand shocks. Then the remaining question is the generality of the results. Maybe excise taxes are very specific kind of shocks and prices respond differently to different kinds of cost shocks. So we tested the implications above with wholesale costs and transportation cost shocks as well. So let me now walk you through the wholesale cost shocks, and the price responses. What we needed was the wholesale cost data, which varies across geographic markets within chain. And luckily, we got some wholesale cost data on cigarettes in 5 states in the US, which is collected by Rosema. We have 4 chains which operate in more than 2 states out of these 5, and there are 9 commonly available cigarette products. And how do we test whether the wholesale cost shocks spill over to other states? We do this by estimating the price response to its own wholesale cost and price response to other markets' wholesale cost. So if our results are indeed robust with the wholesale cost shocks, we expect to see that the response to own cost shock is significantly away from 0, but no responses to other markets' cost shocks. Okay, so we run another regression. It's a simple store product week level. The dependent variable is just price. And we have the product specific wholesale cost that the store S actually faces. So for example, for Kroger in Indiana, this is the wholesale price for Marlboro in Indiana. Therefore, this coefficient rho will tell us the price response to its own wholesale cost. And we, again, let it vary by chain. Next, we have the average wholesale cost from other states, but still, within chain. So for example, again, for Kroger in Indiana, the average Marlboro wholesale cost that Kroger faces in Minnesota, Montana, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. So this coefficient will tell us whether other markets' shocks would spill over to my own price. Again, this is estimated by chain and the standard product store week fixed effects. And we see no spillover. So here are the estimates. They're shrunk, although it doesn't make much difference. As you can see that the price definitely responded to own wholesale cost. However, no responses to other markets' cost shocks. This means that the local wholesale shock only affects the local price, not the price in some other markets within chain. Therefore, we reject the first implication of uniform pricing model with wholesale cost, just like we did with excise taxes. Okay, so next evidence is coming from transportation costs. So we, again, test the implications of uniform pricing models with transportation costs. For transportation costs, we adapted Miller and Weinberg, what they did in Econometrica. So they used the distance to the closest brewery for each beer manufacturer as a proxy for transportation costs. And they use it in their first stage as an instrument. And using their distance data, we can exploit the cross-sectional variation in transportation costs within chain. We don't utilize the temporal variation coming from the Miller-Coors merger because the competition might have changed. So here we have 24 beer products in 39 markets, DMAs, so it's like a metropolitan areas, and 39 chains. Unlike the previous cases, we cannot directly test the spillovers, and I can explain more later if you have time. So instead, what we test is the third implication, which is whether the local response to local cost shock is similar to the local response to some aggregate cost shock. If they are similar, our story is robust, even with transportation cost. And then how do we test that? We actually test it separately. So we first estimate the price response to its own transportation cost shock within chain. And then we separately estimate the price response between chain in the aggregate. So first, let's talk about the within chain estimation. So we estimate the local price response to local transportation cost within chain at the store product level. The dependent variable is the average price of product J in store S in 2007, so right before the merger. T is the distance between the store S to the closest brewery of product J. Therefore, this rho coefficient tells us the price response to own transportation cost shock within chain. Here, we have to control for chain product fixed effects, and this term will basically control for the aggregate chain level response to transportation cost. And we also control for chain market fixed effects to basically net out excise tax events, local competition events, and income events, income effects, etc. Next, between chain estimation is used to approximate the local price response to aggregate transportation cost shock. So this equation is basically just average of the previous within estimation. So the dependent variable is just chain level average for each product. And this transportation cost is the chain level average, again, product specific. And then we have the coefficient in front of this average chain level transportation cost is gonna be the local response to aggregate transportation cost that a certain chain faces. So under uniform pricing model, this coefficient would be larger than rho from the previous slide. And if they are, say, similar, then we pretty much reject the third implication of the uniform pricing model again. And we still keep chain fixed effects, product fixed effects. So let's compare this within and between estimation. The left column shows that each store on average passed through 73 cents per 1,000-mile distance, given a change. And the right column shows that at the chain level, they pass through 78 cents per 1,000 miles as an aggregate distance. This means that the pass-through to local cost shock is not attenuated compared to some national transportation cost shock a chain faces, rejecting the third implication of the uniform pricing model. And you might wonder what this 70-ish cents, whether that makes sense. And it actually so interestingly makes sense. So we use the back of the envelope calculation to translate how much of 1,000 miles cost in terms of trucking cost per case, so 288 ounces of beer. It costs 62 cents, which is really similar to what we actually have estimated. So I think we are pretty confident with these numbers. Okay, so let me wrap up. We show that we reject implications of uniform pricing model with 3 different kinds of cost shocks: excise taxes, wholesale costs, and transportation costs. Therefore, we find that with respect to cost shocks, firms do not price uniformly across geographic markets. So combining this with the uniform pricing literature, our findings show that price responses are asymmetric between local demand and cost shocks. One of our main contribution is policy implication. Basically, it matters to whom the tax is imposed. If you tax consumers, the incidence is entirely borne by consumers. This is an important finding, especially for sin taxes used to control consumption. And the second and maybe more important implication in IO is that we can show the menu of pricing models that fit into this asymmetric responses. So I think the time is up. So I will leave these pricing models in the draft so that you can take a look.
Thank you very much. So now, Andrea, the floor is yours for the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank Marit and the other organizer of the seminar for asking me to discuss this very nice and extremely polished paper. So I'll try to invest my 5 minutes to give an idea where I place the contribution of this paper and then make a couple of comments on things I thought about when reading the paper. So Agnes Bo said very well. I think everything stems from a very influential paper by Della Vigna and Gensko that made the observation that firm having establishment in a geographically dispersed area end up pricing very similarly. So basically, this is kind of realization that our model of firm pricing from the mass colère, which by the way stands in the background of all the demand estimation model we estimate, doesn't seem to work very well in practice. So what I think is that once you digest this insight, you can have two reactions, which can be two different lines of inquiry. The first one is take this as a fact, and then think about how competition work if firms are so constrained in terms of what they can do with price. So, for instance, I saw a few days back a nice paper by Tayater showing that in an online grocery settings, the fees are uniform and constrained to be such, and so firms compete on timeliness of delivery. So you can think of quality, type of products, probability of going stock out. So that's one thing you can ask yourself. The other thing you can do, reacting to the Della Vigna and Gensco insight, is what this paper is trying to do, which is, okay, so the traditional model of pricing doesn't seem to be accurate. Can we learn more about how firms actually do pricing? And so what they're doing is that they're looking at local cost shocks, and they're showing that even though taking for the simplest and more extreme version of the Della Vigna and Gensco paper would imply that they shouldn't have impact in price, instead firms seem to react to cost shock. So there is this kind of additional insights that it seems that firms are not reacting to demand condition, but they might be reactive to cost condition. Okay, so that's kind of the main layer they open up. So in terms of things I thought, the first one is I would have really liked, I think, this is in part of the part we couldn't present on the pricing models, but a bit more of hand-holding on the explanation. Like, it's fine to reconcile with a uniform model. You need a model where firms react to demand, cost shock, not to demand shock. And it would be, I think, it's a bit on you to give me a sense of why a firm would do such thing. So why yes to the cost and not to the demand. Being a bit, the same type of reaction I had on an issue in which you're working. I think I'm very excited about the very recent addition you made in terms of the type of shocks. And the reason is that, just to give a bit of background to everybody, in the actual draft, there is only excise shocks. And now I think you're working on the extension. So, I started working, thinking about what would happen if you extend, and then I saw the result last night. And I come up with a bunch of reasons why, in principle, you might find a different result with generic type of shock than you do with excise. Then, it seems like you're backing up your result with the other ones. But if you are going to write this up, I would like, I'm giving you my 2 cents on how it's structured. So the first thing why excise are a bit special is that the pass-through of excise shock in the literature seems to be much higher than the generic pass-through of other type of shocks. So typically, Conlon and Nirupa Marao comes to mind. They typically say that it's 100% pass-through. Whereas when you have generic cost shock, I think if you think Nakamura and Zerom and Goldberg, Hellerstein, and a bunch of marketing papers, the pass-through elasticity are low, are kind of below 25, and in some cases 60%, but typically not 100%. So why are these excise shock different from the other type of shock? The first thing I think is that typically the excise is observable. So the consumers see that there is a cost shock, and maybe they're more willing to accept the price hike. So in some sense, this moved over the process, which is in the background in your paper, which is a negotiation between the wholesaler and the retailer. So you might not be willing to jack up the price retail-wise because the consumer will get upset about it. Okay, so that's the first reason why it might work different if you have a different type of shock that the consumer is completely unaware. They wouldn't know if the price of malt went up. They wouldn't know if the state is hiking the tax. The second thing that happens is that the excise typically don't float around every few months. So in some sense, they are permanent or persistent, whereas other type of cost shock, they can move around quite a lot. So from that point of view, a retailer might be, if the reason of price inertia is that there are nominal rigidities, you might be unwilling to touch the price at all in response to a cost shock, whereas the excise would prompt you to respond because you know that that's gonna stick around for a while. The third thing which is different is, and this was brought up by Nikita, is that the excise shock are common to all of your competitors, whereas the cost shock, some of them at least, are idiosyncratic to you. So the excise shock is not going to lower my position in terms of the relative convenience of my products. So if you think that the inertia is given by real rigidities as opposed to nominal rigidities, then I'm much less averse to react to an excise shock than I would be to a other type of cost shock. Okay, so if you think about kink demand and this kind of stuff, so that's why I thought maybe you would find something else with looking at other type of shock. So I think it's great direction where you want to go with the paper. If you want to play more, I think if you remember the Dominic Finer food data, they are old, but they have a measure of margins. So you can back up the average acquisition cost, and then you can play even further. And I think, I guess you might have some pressure in finding that the generic cost backs up what you find in excise. The way I see it, you shouldn't find any pressure at all, because there is a lot of explanation why you might find different things, and you're just still learning something on top of what you already show about the excise. There are reasons why the two could diverge. The last thing I want to mention, I think it's a bit unfair, but the moment you open up the Pandora's box of thinking that firms are multi-establishment, one can also think that your supermarket are multi-price, multi-product, sorry. So, I mean, I once spoke to an executive of one of the chain, which is part of your data, and he was telling me that the important thing for them is that customer knows that banana are cheap in their store, because that brings people through the door, and then they can play with everything else. So, which price will we think about when we measure the pass-through? What is the thing the supermarket is looking at? So it is, as you're looking at the price of the UPC, it is the price index for the supermarket, like Pasquale Schiraldi and co-authors have had in paper where you look at the supermarket choice. I mean, incidentally, if you think of loss leaders, if there are such things, you are bound to find a much higher pass-through of cost shock in the loss leader. That's kind of by construction you find that. So if beer, for instance, is a loss leader, that would probably feed into your result. And the last thing I want to mention, I mean, still in terms of which one is the right price to look at, the marketing literature has found, I mean, there is a paper by J.P. Dubé, Besanko, and Gutpa, for example, there is an effect of a cross effect on brands within the same category. So if the price of Coke goes up, the supermarket maybe doesn't want to translate one-on-one, and then it basically smooths the same thing that should happen geographically, according to the Gensco and Dalla Vigna, happens across brand in the same category. So you raise the price of all the sodas, not to raise the price of one particular brand excessively. Or similarly, Mike Watterson has a nice paper on the JME on the penny drop. So basically there is inflation, firm had to jack up the price, but what they do is that they actually compete on the number of products that they can claim are on discount. So what they do is that they discount by a few penny a bunch of items, but then they jack up the price of a few selected items by a few dollars. So, I mean, I don't think this is your paper, maybe it's another paper, but it's just to think that, the moment you start, I mean, the pricing, especially the supermarket, is complicated. So it's kind of, it's not entirely surprising that the prediction of a standard pass-through model would fail, even if, it's not necessarily a failure of the uniform pricing model. It's a very complicated process, but I think, the advances you're making in our understanding of how it works are kind of remarkable, and I think I really enjoy reading the paper. Thank you.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Andrea. Bo, I would like to give you a minute to, if you would like to respond, and then open it up to the general discussion.
Yeah, sounds good. Actually, so my co-author Andrew is in the audience, and he's the expert with the Dominic's data as well as the loss leader literature. So I'll let Andrew answer your questions.
Thanks, Andrea. Some really great, really great comments. Obviously, we've been trying to think about addressing specifically your comments as you referenced that some of the results that both presented today are the things we've been working hard to put together here. So I think your points are spot on. Obviously, excise taxes have a lot of specific features to them, a lot of specific features that you mentioned, the persistence of them, the fact that they're common to all the relevant competitors you might imagine might make the pass-throughs we observe for them different just for other reasons. So you mentioned some others, the exchange rate pass-through rates have found to be much lower. One thing that I guess I find comforting in terms of the previous literature is just that while exchange rate pass-throughs tend to be muted or mild, the evidence has also been pretty suggestive that changes in wholesale prices to retail prices do tend to be quite high. And so we interpret that, as well as the results that Bo Bo's already presented, as well as the distances, as again, just trying to flesh out the details of just how strong or how firm this uniform pricing asymmetry might be. And then to your point on loss leader, yeah, I think this is a great one. We've for this project focused, just given the identification strategy, to stick to the product level. But as you correctly point out, I mean, the retailer's pricing decision is absolutely a multi-product consideration, and to the extent that a cost shock that's effectively levied at the category level, which these excise taxes are, is really a much different pricing problem than one that you would imagine, as you've already referenced some of the other literatures, that you might imagine a marginal cost shock that is specific to a product in a category. I think our results, when it comes to the new results, and again, we apologize for that in terms of getting it to you, but in regards to the distance, should speak a little bit to that, given that that's going to be variation at a product level within a category. And so, but certainly more work needs to be done on that front. So thank you for the wonderful comments. Those certainly make for a better paper.
So as we are 1 minute to 4 in London time, so this has been really great. But let's perhaps finish now with the official part of the seminar. And Bo agreed to stay for extra minutes here, and we can continue the unofficial discussion with those who have time to hang around. So thank you, Bo, thank you, Andrea, and thank you all the participants to coming to the seminar.
Thank you, everyone.